They called her the richest girl in the world before she could fully understand what money could erase. This story does not begin with blood at a gate, but with smoke, inheritance, and silence. Long before a man died outside her mansion, millions were already dying for her fortune. Doris Duke was born into an empire that thrived on a habit engineered to kill slowly. Her father, James Buchanan Duke, transformed tobacco from a regional crop into a global addiction, flooding the world with cigarettes that promised sophistication while delivering disease. By the time Doris inherited his fortune, the damage was already incalculable, yet the money kept flowing, clean, legal, and celebrated. She did not build this empire. She absorbed it, suddenly and completely, after her father's death in 1925. At 12 years old, Doris became one of the wealthiest individuals on Earth, wrapped in luxury before she had the tools to understand consequence. Newspapers marveled at her inheritance. Society admired the scale of it. No one asked what kind of moral vacuum that level of unearned power creates in a child. Her wealth was not abstract. It reshaped institutions, landscapes, and reputations. Duke University stood as a public symbol of generosity and permanence, a philanthropic monument built with profits drawn from human lungs. The contradiction was never hidden. It was simply accepted. Tobacco money built futures while quietly ending others. Inside that contradiction, Doris grew up watched, managed, and isolated. Every movement catalogued, every relationship filtered through advisors and trustees. She learned early that money could solve problems without explanation. It could close doors, smooth narratives, and quiet uncomfortable questions. When something went wrong, it did not become a crisis. It became a transaction. This is the foundation of the story. Not the accident at the gate, not the whispers that followed, but a lifetime spent inside a system, where harm was normalized as long as it was profitable and distant. Before one man was killed instantly, millions were lost slowly, and the world applauded the fortune left behind. By the time Doris Duke reached adolescence, her name had already hardened into a symbol. Newspapers did not describe her as a person so much as a figure, an inheritance made flesh. The richest girl in the world was a phrase repeated so often it lost its meaning. Yet its consequences shaped every corner of her life. Wealth at that scale does not simply provide comfort. It distorts reality. Her childhood unfolded under constant supervision. Trustees, lawyers, and guardians surrounded her, each tasked with protecting a fortune far larger than the child who possessed it. Decisions were made in rooms she never entered. Conversations about her future took place as if she were an asset rather than a daughter. She was educated privately, traveled widely, and lived among adults who measured relationships in discretion and loyalty rather than affection. Money followed her everywhere, heavy and unavoidable. It dictated who could approach her and why. It blurred sincerity into performance. Compliments felt rehearsed. Friendships came with expectations. Even grief, after the death of her father, was managed and muted, folded into schedules and legal procedures. There was no space for ordinary mistakes, only reputational risk. Public fascination fed this pressure. Society columns chronicled her movements with breathless admiration. Her dresses, her homes, her travels were reported as cultural events. She learned early that visibility was not optional. Privacy had to be purchased, enforced, and guarded. Over time, that vigilance hardened into control. Yet alongside the spectacle, a careful narrative formed. Doris Duke was portrayed as benevolent, cultured, and generous. Her charitable donations reinforced this image, particularly those connected to education, medicine, and the arts. These gifts were real and often substantial, but they also served a quieter purpose. They framed her wealth as socially redeeming, converting inherited harm into public good. This duality followed her into adulthood. On one hand, she funded institutions that promised progress and enlightenment. On the other, her fortune remained inseparable from an industry that thrived on addiction and premature death. The contradiction was rarely challenged directly. Polite society preferred gratitude to interrogation. As Doris grew older, the imbalance between her power and accountability became more pronounced. She married and divorced, formed intense attachments, and severed them just as quickly. Staff members came and went, often abruptly. Loyalty was rewarded generously, but disagreement was rarely tolerated. Those closest to her learned to navigate moods rather than question decisions. Psychologically, this environment left its mark. When obstacles arose, Doris did not learn negotiation in the ordinary sense. She learned removal. Problems disappeared when money intervened. Consequences softened or vanished entirely. Over time, this produced a dangerous lesson that reality itself was flexible. Her properties reflected this mindset. Each home was meticulously curated, controlled, and insulated from the outside world. They were places where she dictated atmosphere, movement, and access. Within those walls, Doris was not an heiress under scrutiny. She was sovereign. Despite the privilege, unease followed her. The more insulated her life became, the more suspicious she grew of motives around her. Trust narrowed. Surveillance increased. Control became both shield and weapon. By midlife, Doris Duke was no longer merely protected by wealth. She was enclosed by it. By the time Doris Duke retreated more fully into her estates, including the mansion that would later become infamous, she carried with her a lifetime of unchallenged power. The world had taught her that mistakes could be reframed, conflicts settled quietly, and narratives rewritten with enough influence. When tragedy finally arrived at her gates, it did not occur in isolation. It emerged from a long history of insulation, silence, and belief that wealth could soften any blow. Long before a body lay on the pavement, the conditions that made the outcome possible were already firmly in place. Rough Point did not announce itself the way other Newport mansions did. While neighboring estates flaunted symmetry and ceremony, this house leaned into the edge of the Atlantic with a quieter authority, as if it had nothing to prove. Set apart from the grand social circuits of Bellevue Avenue, Rough Point stood as both residence and barrier, a place designed not for welcome, but for control. When Doris Duke acquired the property, she did not treat it as a seasonal retreat. She treated it as a domain. The mansion became an extension of her internal world, ordered, curated, and fiercely defended. Thick stone walls separated it from the street. Gates regulated access. From the outside, it appeared serene. From within, it operated with precision. Newport itself carried a long memory. The city had once been the playground of American wealth, a place where fortunes paraded openly. By the time Doris Duke settled more deeply into Rough Point, that era had faded, leaving behind echoes of excess and quiet resentment. Locals were accustomed to rich outsiders, but Duke was different. She did not mingle. She observed. Inside the mansion, nothing was accidental. Rooms were arranged with museum-level care. Furniture was placed not for comfort, but for position. Artifacts from across the world were displayed with deliberate intent, reflecting both refinement and ownership. Each object testified to reach and influence, a reminder that the woman who lived here could acquire almost anything. Staff quickly learned the unspoken rules. Movement was noticed, conversations traveled, loyalty was expected, not requested. Rough Point functioned less like a home and more like a controlled environment. Employees entered knowing they were guests in someone else's universe. Many stayed only briefly. Those who remained adapted. Doris Duke's relationship with the outside world narrowed within these walls. Visitors were screened, invitations were rare. When guests did arrive, they encountered a hostess who was precise, observant, and distant. The mansion did not soften her, it sharpened her. Security measures increased over time. Gates were kept closed, sight lines were protected. The property line mattered. It was not paranoia in the cinematic sense, but a cultivated vigilance born from decades of scrutiny and betrayal. Duke had learned that wealth attracted attention, and attention invited risk. Rough Point also offered something she could not find elsewhere: silence. The ocean drowned out distant sounds. The estate's isolation muted intrusion. Here, Doris Duke could exist without performance. There were no society columns inside the gates, no public expectations, only rules she set herself. Yet this isolation came with a cost. The longer she retreated into Rough Point, the more absolute her authority became within it. Disagreement diminished, correction vanished. When a person controls the environment entirely, reality begins to bend around them. Those closest to her understood this. Designers, assistants, and advisors learned to read moods carefully. Praise came unexpectedly. Anger arrived without warning. Decisions were final. Apologies were rare. The mansion did not merely house these dynamics, it amplified them. Rough Point was also a place of contradiction. It was beautiful, meticulously maintained, and culturally significant. It was also tense. The air carried an unspoken understanding that comfort was conditional. Everything functioned smoothly until it did not. From the street, the gates appeared ordinary, functional, unremarkable. They marked the boundary between public road and private world. But to Doris Duke, that boundary mattered deeply. It was the final line of control, the point where her authority ended and the world began. It is important to understand this setting before understanding what happened there. The events that would later define Rough Point did not occur in a vacuum. They unfolded at a place designed to limit interference, to concentrate power, and to keep decisions internal. When tragedy eventually arrived at those gates, it did not shatter the order of Rough Point. It collided with it. What followed would raise questions not only about one moment, but about the environment that shaped it. Long before the incident that would stain the estate's legacy, Rough Point had already become something more than a mansion. It was a fortress of wealth, will, and silence, standing quietly above the Atlantic, waiting. By the time Doris Duke reached middle age, the word most often used to describe her was eccentric. It appeared in profiles, whispered by acquaintances, and softened by journalists who struggled to explain behavior that did not fit polite expectations. Eccentricity was convenient. It suggested harmless oddity rather than authority exercised without restraint. But those who worked closest to her understood that what appeared unusual from a distance often functioned as control up close. Doris Duke did not trust easily, and over time, that distrust hardened into a system. She monitored staff movements, demanded strict adherence to schedules, and kept detailed awareness of who entered and exited her homes. Privacy, which she guarded fiercely for herself, was rarely extended to others. Employees were expected to exist within defined boundaries, emotional as well as physical. Her moods could shift quickly. Warmth and generosity were real, but unpredictable. A favored employee could be rewarded lavishly one day and dismissed the next over a perceived slight. The lack of explanation was part of the power. When people do not understand why approval disappears, they stop questioning authority altogether. Relationships followed a similar pattern. Doris formed intense attachments, personal and professional, then abruptly withdrew when trust fractured. The withdrawal was absolute. Once removed from her inner circle, few ever returned. This created an atmosphere where disagreement felt dangerous and silence felt safer. Publicly, these traits were often romanticized. Newspapers framed her behavior as the natural result of isolation and wealth. Society accepted that a woman of her stature might be difficult. Wealth excused rigidity. Influence reframed volatility as complexity. Privately, the environment she cultivated rewarded obedience. Advisors learned to present information carefully, filtering reality through what they believed she wanted to hear. Over time, this created an echo chamber. Dissent did not vanish because it was disproven, but because it was unwelcome. This distinction matters. True eccentricity is personal. Control reshapes others. Within her estates, Doris Duke's authority was complete. She decided access, schedules, and priorities. Even creative collaborators were expected to conform to her vision. Design was not a shared process. It was an extension of her will. There was also an undercurrent of vigilance. Duke feared betrayal, gossip, and exploitation. These fears were not entirely unfounded. Her wealth made her a target for manipulation. But instead of creating safeguards that invited accountability, she constructed barriers that concentrated power inward. Over time, this vigilance evolved into suspicion. Staff interactions were scrutinized. Conversations were interpreted. Neutral actions could be perceived as defiance. The line between caution and paranoia blurred, not through delusion, but through reinforcement. When no one challenges your assumptions, every suspicion feels confirmed. Importantly, this control did not exist in isolation from her generosity. Doris Duke funded causes she believed in. She supported cultural preservation, medical research, and education. These actions complicate any attempt to reduce her to a villain. She was capable of empathy and vision. But generosity and dominance are not opposites. They often coexist. The danger arises when generosity shields authority from scrutiny. When someone gives enough, society hesitates to question how they behave behind closed doors. Philanthropy becomes insulation. Reputation becomes armor. Those closest to Doris Duke lived within this contradiction. They benefited from her patronage while navigating her unpredictability. Many rationalized difficult behavior as the cost of proximity to power. Others left quietly, unwilling to endure the tension. What is striking is how rarely this dynamic was challenged formally. There were no meaningful external checks on her conduct within her private world. Wealth eliminated the need for negotiation. Legal boundaries existed, but social ones dissolved. By the time the events at Rough Point began to unfold, Doris Duke had spent decades operating in environments where her interpretation of reality prevailed. Not because it was always correct, but because it was rarely opposed. When control becomes routine, resistance feels like betrayal. When resistance appears, response follows instinct rather than reflection. The question that lingers is not whether Doris Duke was eccentric. It is whether the systems around her allowed control to grow unchecked. The answer to that question would matter deeply when one moment at one gate turned irreversible. Eduardo Tirella did not enter Doris Duke's life as an employee in the ordinary sense. He arrived as a collaborator, a trusted presence invited into spaces few were ever allowed to shape. Interior designers often decorate rooms. Tirella helped define environments that reflected Doris Duke's inner order, her taste, and her need for control. That distinction mattered. Tirella was not simply hired to select fabrics or arrange furniture. He was involved in long-term aesthetic decisions across multiple properties, including Rough Point. His work required proximity, conversation, and an understanding of Duke's preferences that went beyond surface beauty. He learned how she thought about space, how she reacted to imbalance, and how deeply she cared about visual harmony as an expression of authority. Their relationship unfolded over years, not months. Trust was built slowly, through shared projects and repeated approvals. In a world where Doris Duke dismissed people easily, longevity carried weight. Tyrella was one of the few who remained. This closeness placed him in a rare position. He was neither a distant contractor nor a silent servant. He spoke to her regularly. He offered opinions. He negotiated creative choices. Within Duke's tightly controlled environment, that alone marked him as different. But proximity to power is never neutral. The closer someone stands to authority, the more fragile their position becomes. Familiarity can be mistaken for safety, even as it increases risk. Edoardo Tyrella was known among staff as professional and meticulous. He understood Duke's expectations and worked to meet them. He navigated her moods carefully, adapting without open confrontation. This ability to manage tension made him valuable, but it also placed him under constant pressure. In Duke's world, value could vanish instantly. As projects progressed at Rough Point, Tyrella's influence over the estate's interior became substantial. He helped curate rooms that balanced grandeur with restraint, spaces that communicated permanence rather than excess. The mansion, already a fortress of isolation, became more refined under his guidance. Its atmosphere grew quieter, more deliberate. This refinement mattered to Doris Duke. Rough Point was not meant to impress guests. It was meant to stabilize her. Any disruption to that balance was felt sharply. Over time, the professional boundaries between Duke and Tyrella blurred. They spoke frequently. Decisions overlapped. Disagreements, when they occurred, carried emotional weight. In an environment where dissent was rare, even small conflicts could escalate. It is important to be precise here. There is no public record of constant hostility between Doris Duke and Edoardo Tyrella. What exists instead are patterns: closeness followed by tension, trust shadowed by strain. Those patterns align with many of Duke's other long-term relationships. As Tyrella's role expanded, so did expectations. The pressure to anticipate Duke's desires increased. When he succeeded, praise followed. When he failed, frustration surfaced. This unpredictability shaped the dynamic between them. For Doris Duke, control over space was control over self. A misaligned room could feel like a personal affront. A disagreement over design could register as defiance. This context, Tyrella's position was uniquely vulnerable. He was responsible for maintaining not just beauty, but emotional equilibrium. By the time the events at Rough Point approached, Tyrella was no longer simply a designer passing through. He was embedded in the daily rhythm of Duke's private world. He understood her routines, her habits, and her sensitivities. That familiarity, while valuable, removed protective distance. The final days before the incident were not publicly documented in detail. What is known is that Tyrella was present at Rough Point, engaged in work related to the property. There was no indication that his presence was unusual or contentious on its own. He was where he was expected to be. This normalcy is critical. The tragedy that followed did not erupt from an obvious crisis visible to outsiders. It emerged from within a relationship shaped by years of closeness, imbalance, and unspoken tension. When someone dies suddenly within such a context, attention naturally turns to motive. But motive is not required for harm to occur. In environments where authority is concentrated and emotional regulation is strained, moments can escalate faster than intention can intervene. Edoardo Tyrella's role in this story is not to serve as a symbol or a narrative device. He was a real person whose professional life intersected with immense power. His death demands seriousness, not speculation. What can be said with certainty is this: he was not a stranger at the gates of Rough Point. He was not an intruder or an outsider. He belonged there in the practical sense, which makes what happened next impossible to dismiss as random. His proximity to Doris Duke placed him at the center of her private world. When events unfolded at the boundary of that world, the meaning of that proximity became tragically clear. In stories of wealth and power, attention often fixates on the figure at the top. But understanding the people closest to them reveals more than admiration or condemnation ever could. Eduardo Tirella's presence illuminates the human cost of proximity to unchecked authority. By the time he stood at the gates of Rough Point, he carried years of shared history with the woman behind the wheel. That history did not protect him. It did not slow events. It did not invite caution from the systems designed to respond afterward. Instead, it vanished almost as quickly as the official explanation that followed. What remains is a silence filled with unanswered questions, not because answers are unknowable, but because they were never fully pursued. And in that silence, Eduardo Tirella becomes the turning point of this story. The events that unfolded at the gates of Rough Point did not announce themselves as history. They arrived quietly, without witnesses gathered in anticipation or alarms sounding across the estate. There was no spectacle, no crowd, no immediate sense that something irreversible was about to occur. That absence is part of what continues to haunt the story. It was an ordinary moment within an extraordinary setting. Eduardo Tirella was present at Rough Point in the course of his professional duties. There was nothing unusual about his being there. He had walked that property countless times before, passed through those gates without incident, spoken with Doris Duke on matters both trivial and consequential. The environment was familiar, routine, controlled. Doris Duke was behind the wheel of her station wagon. The vehicle itself was not remarkable, practical rather than luxurious, consistent with her preference for utility over display within her private spaces. The gates marked the transition between the secluded world of Rough Point and the public road beyond. That boundary, so carefully maintained, was about to become the focal point of the story. What happened next has been described in official records as an accident. According to the account accepted by authorities, Doris Duke struck Eduardo Tirella with her vehicle near the gates of the estate. He was pinned and dragged across the roadway. The injuries were fatal. Emergency services were called. Eduardo Tirella was pronounced dead. The sequence of events is brief when reduced to official language. That brevity conceals the violence of the moment. Being struck by a vehicle and dragged is not instantaneous. It is chaotic, forceful, and irreversible once momentum takes over. Even without intent, the physical reality is severe. There are details that remain consistent across accounts. The location was at or near the gates of Rough Point. Doris Duke was driving. Eduardo Tirella was on foot. The vehicle did not stop immediately. These facts are not disputed. What diverges is interpretation. Authorities concluded quickly that the incident was accidental. The explanation centered on confusion, poor visibility, and misjudgment. No charges were filed. No prolonged investigation followed. The case was closed with efficiency that, to some, suggested professionalism, and to others, suggested deference. For those outside the circle of wealth, the speed of the conclusion was striking. Fatal accidents typically generate layers of scrutiny. Statements are examined. Timelines are reconstructed. Independent witnesses are sought. In this case, the process moved swiftly toward resolution. There was no public trial. No jury weighed evidence. The accepted narrative settled almost immediately, leaving little room for competing interpretations to gain traction. It is important to remain disciplined here. There is no definitive proof that the incident was anything other than an accident. To state otherwise would be to cross from analysis into allegation. Yet absence of proof is not the same as absence of question. The setting complicates interpretation. Rough Point was not a public intersection. It was private property transitioning into public space. Access was controlled. Visibility was shaped by gates, walls, and landscaping. This was not a chaotic urban street. It was a known environment. The relationship between Doris Duke and Edoardo Tirella adds further complexity. He was not an unknown pedestrian. He was someone she knew well, someone whose presence would not have been surprising. This familiarity does not imply intent, but it does challenge explanations based solely on surprise. Then there is the matter of emotional context. As established earlier, Doris Duke's relationships were often intense. Disagreements, when they occurred, carried disproportionate weight. Control over her environment mattered deeply to her sense of order. Any disruption near the gates of her estate would have been felt sharply. Again, these are contextual factors, not conclusions. The official response did not explore them publicly. News of Edoardo Tirella's death spread quickly, but reporting remained restrained. Headlines echoed the official ruling. Language was careful. Doris Duke's name carried gravity, and gravity alters tone. Speculation was muted. Questions were softened. Within Newport, reaction was more complex. Locals spoke quietly. Conversations happened behind closed doors. Doubts circulated without formal expression. People noticed what had happened, and they noticed how quickly it was resolved. Silence followed. For Doris Duke, the incident marked a rupture, though not one that forced public reckoning. She did not face arrest. She did not stand before cameras. Life continued within the boundaries of her estate, though altered by absence. The gates of Rough Point, once a symbol of control and separation, became a point of fixation. They represented the moment where private authority collided with public consequence. Yet the collision did not produce impact proportional to the event. No independent inquiry unfolded. No sustained media pressure demanded deeper examination. The accepted explanation settled into record, and record became memory. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable, not because of what can be proven, but because of what was never tested. In systems governed by wealth and influence, the burden of proof often shifts subtly. Doubt must be overwhelming to disrupt established narratives. In this case, doubt remained ambient rather than actionable. Edoardo Tirella's death became a closed chapter in official terms. There were no appeals, no reopened files. His name faded from headlines, resurfacing only in quiet conversations and retrospective accounts. The physical reality of what occurred remains stark. A man died violently at the gates of a private estate. The driver was one of the most powerful women in America. The conclusion was reached swiftly and decisively. What the incident did not produce is just as telling as what it did. There was no prolonged moral debate, no institutional soul-searching, no reassessment of how power shapes accountability. For Doris Duke, the incident reinforced a pattern she had lived within her entire life. Problems, even catastrophic ones, could be managed quietly. Narratives could be stabilized. The world would move on. That does not require malice. It requires structure. The tragedy at the gates of Rough Point exists within that structure. It is neither a proven crime nor a simple mishap free of context. It sits in the uneasy space between, sustained by unanswered questions and the knowledge that some questions were never encouraged. As years passed, the official story remained unchanged. Doris Duke continued her life largely insulated from public challenge. Rough Point stood as it always had, overlooking the Atlantic, its gates repaired, its grounds maintained. Edoardo Tirella did not return. The absence he left behind was not marked by memorials or public grief. It lingered instead as an unspoken weight, carried by those who remembered the man and the moment. The night at the gates did not redefine Doris Duke's public identity. It did not dismantle her authority. It did not trigger reform. It simply closed, officially and efficiently. That closure, more than any speculation about intent, is what continues to trouble observers. When an event of such severity leaves so little institutional trace, it raises questions not about one person, but about the systems that surround them. This chapter is not about declaring guilt. It is about acknowledging gravity. A man died at the gates of Rough Point. The explanation was accepted. The story moved on. But history has a way of returning to moments that were too quickly put to rest. In the aftermath of Eduardo Tirella's death, the most striking feature was not public outrage or prolonged mourning. It was speed. The machinery of authority moved with unusual efficiency, arriving at a conclusion almost as quickly as it had been summoned. In a case involving a violent death, that speed became the story. Police responded, statements were taken, and within a short span of time, the incident was officially ruled an accident. The explanation entered the record cleanly, without qualifiers that might invite further scrutiny. The matter was treated as resolved. No criminal charges were filed. No extended inquiry followed. The file closed. For many observers, particularly those familiar with how fatal incidents are normally handled, this raised an immediate question. Not an accusation, but a procedural curiosity. Why so fast? In most cases involving a pedestrian death caused by a vehicle, investigators reconstruct events carefully. They examine vehicle damage, road conditions, lighting, and sight lines. They compare statements. They look for inconsistencies. When the driver and the victim share a close relationship, scrutiny often increases rather than diminishes. Familiarity complicates accident narratives. At Rough Point, the process did not unfold that way. The ruling relied heavily on Doris Duke's account of events. Her explanation centered on confusion at the gate, misjudgment, and the unintended consequences of movement in a constrained space. These claims were accepted as sufficient. There was no public indication of adversarial questioning or prolonged analysis. This is not proof of wrongdoing. Authorities are capable of reaching correct conclusions quickly, but when speed aligns with power, it invites examination. Doris Duke was not an ordinary driver. She was one of the wealthiest individuals in the country, a figure whose philanthropy touched institutions, universities, and cultural organizations. Her name carried weight beyond the immediate facts of the case. Influence does not require explicit corruption to shape outcomes. Often, it operates through expectation. No one needed to say the words. Everyone understood the implications. The media response mirrored the official tone. Reporting was restrained, factual, and cautious. Articles emphasized the ruling rather than the event itself. Language was softened. There was little appetite for speculation, and little encouragement for dissenting voices to emerge. This restraint contrasts sharply with how the press often behaves in cases involving prominent figures. Sensationalism is common. Here, discretion prevailed. Within Newport, the reaction diverged from the headlines. Conversations unfolded quietly. Locals discussed the incident among themselves, not in public forums. The shared understanding was not uniform belief in guilt, but discomfort with closure. People noticed the absence of visible process. Why was there no inquest? Why no extended review? Why did the story end so neatly? Such questions did not coalesce into action. Newport was accustomed to wealth, but also dependent on it. Estates supported local economies. Challenging powerful residents carried social and economic risk. Silence was safer than confrontation. Time passed, and with it, momentum faded. The ruling hardened into fact simply because it remained uncontested. Official truth, once established, becomes self-reinforcing. Reopening a closed case requires pressure. Pressure requires outrage. Outrage never fully materialized. For Doris Duke, the verdict reinforced a lifelong lesson. Systems worked in her favor. Even when events were tragic and irreversible, resolution arrived without prolonged exposure. She did not need to defend herself publicly. She did not need to explain. The conclusion spoke for her. This outcome did not occur in isolation. It fit a broader pattern of how wealth interfaces with accountability. Legal systems are designed to be impartial, but they operate within social contexts. When a defendant possesses resources, reputation, and institutional goodwill, those contexts shift. Investigators are human. Prosecutors are pragmatic. Institutions prefer stability to uncertainty. When presented with a plausible explanation from a powerful source, the path of least resistance often becomes the official one. That does not require conspiracy. It requires alignment. The absence of challenge is as revealing as the presence of authority. No independent body pressed for further examination. No sustained journalistic effort questioned the ruling. The moment passed. Eduardo Tirella's family did not mount a public campaign. Their silence has been interpreted in various ways, none of which can be verified. Grief manifests differently. Pursuing justice against overwhelming power can feel futile. As years went on, the incident receded into the background of Doris Duke's life story. It was mentioned occasionally, often briefly, sometimes with euphemism. Over time, it became a footnote rather than a focal point. But footnotes linger. For historians and observers, the speed of the verdict remains unsettling, not because it proves corruption, but because it demonstrates how easily certainty can be manufactured through closure. Once a case is labeled resolved, questioning it becomes socially disruptive. The verdict at Rough Point did more than end an investigation. It set a boundary around discussion. To challenge it was to challenge authority, reputation, and the institutions that had accepted the explanation. In this way, the ruling did not merely describe an event. It shaped memory. Doris Duke continued to live within the protections her wealth afforded. She funded causes, preserved art, and maintained properties. The narrative of benevolence endured, largely uninterrupted. Eduardo Tirella's name faded. The contrast between these trajectories is difficult to ignore. One life ended violently and quietly. The other proceeded with minimal disruption. Justice is not only about legality, it is about confidence. In Newport, confidence never fully returned. The whispers persisted, passed down in local memory rather than formal record. They did not accuse directly. They questioned indirectly. That questioning matters, because when systems close ranks too quickly, they teach the public a dangerous lesson. That some stories are not meant to be examined too closely. That some truths are settled by authority rather than inquiry. The fastest verdict is not always the weakest, but it is often the one most vulnerable to doubt. And doubt, once planted, does not fade easily. As the years moved forward, the gates of Rough Point remained closed. The case officially concluded. Yet the shadow cast by that speed followed Doris Duke's legacy, shaping how her life and power would later be re-evaluated. The verdict ended the investigation. It did not end the story. When official conclusions close a case quickly, they do not erase uncertainty. They compress it. Doubt retreats from public record and settles into private conversation, where it persists without evidence, without resolution, and without expiration. This is what happened after the verdict at Rough Point. The story did not end. It went underground. In Newport, memory works differently than headlines. The city carries layers of history beneath its polished facades. Families remember who owned which estates, who employed whom, who left town suddenly, and who never returned. Stories circulate quietly, shaped by repetition rather than proof. Over time, they become part of the local fabric. Eduardo Tirella's death entered that fabric almost immediately. No one stood on street corners making accusations. There were no public demonstrations or open challenges to the ruling. Instead, there were pauses in conversation when his name surfaced. There were lowered voices. There were phrases that stopped short of conclusion. People did not say what happened was murder. They said it was strange. They said it was too fast. They said it never sat right. These were not statements of fact. They were expressions of unease. The whispers followed a pattern common to communities shaped by wealth. Newport relied on its estates, its benefactors, and its reputation. Challenging powerful figures risked social and economic consequences. Silence was not always agreement. Often, it was survival. Within this environment, doubt learned to coexist with official truth. Residents accepted the verdict publicly while questioning it privately. This duality allowed daily life to continue without confrontation. It also ensured that unresolved questions remained unresolved. Over time, these doubts took on symbolic weight. The gates of Rough Point became more than a location. They became shorthand for the limits of accountability. People referenced them without explanation, assuming shared understanding. The phrase carried implication without accusation. What made the whispers endure was not a single inconsistency, but a collection of absences. There was no detailed reconstruction released to the public, no extended forensic discussion, no independent review. The lack of visible process invited speculation, not because people wanted scandal, but because they wanted clarity. Psychologically, humans struggle with unresolved narratives. When a story ends abruptly, the mind continues writing it. In the absence of information, imagination fills the gaps. Doris Duke's own behavior after the incident contributed to this effect. She did not offer public reflection. She did not address the loss beyond what was required. This silence was consistent with her lifelong approach to privacy and control, but in this context, it amplified discomfort. To some observers, restraint appeared dignified. To others, it felt cold. The truth is that silence is ambiguous. It can signal grief, legal advice, emotional withdrawal, or indifference. Without explanation, interpretation multiplies. As years passed, new generations in Newport inherited the story. Younger residents heard it secondhand, stripped of detail but heavy with implication. It became part of the city's informal history, told cautiously, often prefaced with reminders that it was only a belief, only a rumor. The endurance of these whispers reveals something important. Communities do not cling to doubt without reason. They do so when closure feels incomplete. Yet it is equally important to acknowledge restraint. The whispers never hardened into collective accusation because they lacked proof. Newport's doubts lived in the space between skepticism and respect for evidence. People sensed imbalance, but they also recognized limits. This tension shaped how Doris Duke herself was remembered locally. She was not universally vilified. Many acknowledged her generosity, her contributions, her preservation efforts. At the same time, there was distance. Admiration did not translate into affection. Respect did not erase wariness. The mansion remained a focal point. Rough Point stood unchanged, its grounds immaculate, its gates closed. Visitors passed by without incident. Life continued. But the estate's symbolic weight grew heavier. In storytelling, settings absorb meaning from events. Rough Point became associated not only with wealth and isolation, but with unresolved consequence. It was a place where questions lingered longer than answers. Outside Newport, interest in the incident faded more quickly. National attention moved on. Doris Duke's broader legacy regained prominence, framed through philanthropy and cultural influence. The death of Eduardo Tirella remained a brief mention, if it appeared at all. This divergence between local memory and public narrative is significant. It illustrates how power shapes which stories endure and which recede. National narratives favor achievements. Local narratives remember disruptions. For historians and later observers, the whispers present a challenge. They cannot be cited as evidence. They cannot be dismissed as irrelevant. They exist as social data, reflecting collective perception rather than factual determination. Ignoring them oversimplifies the story. Elevating them beyond their limits distorts it. The most responsible approach is to acknowledge their existence without endorsing their conclusions. Doubt itself is not an accusation. It is a response to imbalance. Over time, the whispers influenced how the incident was revisited in retrospectives. Writers approached the topic cautiously, aware of legal boundaries and ethical responsibility. The language shifted from certainty to question, from statement to implication. This shift mirrors a broader cultural reckoning with power. As public awareness of institutional bias grew, stories like this gained renewed relevance, not as proof of crime, but as case studies in how influence shapes process. Eduardo Torrella's name resurfaced periodically, often in connection with discussions of wealth and accountability. Each time, the same pattern emerged. Official records were cited, doubts were mentioned, conclusions remained elusive. What persisted most strongly was not belief in guilt, but belief in inequality. The sense that had the circumstances involved different people, the outcome might have unfolded differently. That belief, whether accurate or not, carries weight. It reflects public trust, or lack thereof, in systems meant to apply equally. Doris Duke did not live to see the full evolution of this cultural shift. Her life continued, her legacy expanded, her estates preserved. Rough Point eventually transformed from private fortress to public museum. Its rooms opened to visitors who walked the same paths without knowing every story attached to them. The gates remain. Visitors pass through them now, unaware that for decades they symbolized a boundary not just of property, but of inquiry. They mark the place where an event occurred and where questioning stopped. The whispers never accused outright. They did something subtler and perhaps more enduring. They refused to forget. In the absence of formal reckoning, memory became the archive, imperfect, subjective, and persistent. The whispers that followed the verdict at Rough Point did not overturn history. They simply ensured that it remained unsettled. And in that unsettled space, the story continues. The legacy of Doris Duke exists on two parallel timelines, both undeniable, both deeply uncomfortable when viewed together. One is measured in decades, balance sheets, and institutions that still bear the imprint of her fortune. The other is measured in moments, a brief span at the gates of a mansion, and the abrupt end of a human life. These timelines rarely intersect in public memory, yet they are inseparable. The fortune that defined Doris Duke's life was built on a product designed to kill slowly. Cigarettes did not deliver violence in a single instant. They worked quietly over years through habit, addiction, and social normalization. The damage was dispersed across populations, across continents, across generations. Responsibility became abstract. No single death could be traced cleanly back to a single hand. This diffusion mattered. It allowed profit to coexist with respectability. Tobacco wealth funded universities, museums, hospitals, and cultural preservation. The same money that shortened lives extended legacies. Society accepted the trade because the harm was gradual and invisible in the moment. Doris Duke inherited this system fully formed. She did not invent it, but she benefited from it without having to confront its consequences directly. By the time she came into her inheritance, the moral debate around tobacco was already dulled by familiarity. Smoking was embedded in culture. Its dangers were known, yet tolerated. This normalization of distant harm shaped the ethical atmosphere around her fortune. It established a precedent. Suffering could be real, widespread, and lethal, yet still remain background noise if it unfolded slowly enough. Against this backdrop, Eduardo Tirella's death stands apart. It was immediate. It was physical. It left no time for abstraction. A man was alive, then he was not. There was no gradual decline, no years of denial. The violence of the event demanded acknowledgement, even if only briefly. The contrast between these two forms of death is central to understanding the discomfort surrounding the incident at Rough Point. Cigarettes killed millions, yet no single moment demanded accountability. Eduardo Tirella's death demanded it instantly. The systems that absorbed one kind of harm were not designed to absorb the other. This distinction exposes a deeper truth about power and perception. Harm that unfolds slowly can be rationalized. Harm that unfolds suddenly requires explanation. When explanation arrives too quickly, suspicion follows. The official ruling framed Tirella's death as an accident, a tragic convergence of circumstances without malice. Legally, this closed the case. Morally, it left space unfilled. That space became a mirror, reflecting the broader history of the fortune itself. In both instances, harm occurred within structures that protected those at the center. In both, responsibility was diffused. In one, across an industry. In the other, across procedure. This is not an argument of equivalence. Doris Duke did not personally manufacture cigarettes. She did not personally design addiction, nor is there proof that she intended harm at the gates of Rough Point. The parallel lies not in intent, but in outcome and insulation. Wealth created distance. That distance allowed suffering to exist without direct confrontation. For decades, tobacco profits flowed, while death statistics rose elsewhere. At Rough Point, death occurred nearby, but the mechanisms of authority absorbed the shock before it could travel far. In both cases, systems worked as designed. The public response to these harms followed predictable patterns. Tobacco deaths became statistics. Tirella's death became a footnote. Institutions continued. Estates remained intact. Life moved forward. This continuity is unsettling precisely because it feels normal. Society is accustomed to separating legacy from consequence. We celebrate endowments without tracing their origins. We admire preservation without interrogating what was preserved at whose cost. Doris Duke's life embodies this separation. Her philanthropic contributions were real. They funded research, preserved history, and enriched culture. These outcomes cannot be dismissed, but neither can they be used to erase the circumstances that accompanied them. Eduardo Tirella's death disrupts the comfort of that separation. It refuses to remain abstract. It forces the question, how much harm can be absorbed by reputation before it becomes visible? The answer, historically, is a great deal. For years after the incident, Doris Duke's public image remained largely intact. She continued to be described as eccentric, reclusive, generous. The narrative bent around the event, accommodating it without allowing it to dominate. This bending mirrors how society treats many powerful figures. Singular moments of controversy are smoothed over by longevity, influence, and contribution. Time becomes an ally. Memory fades selectively. Yet some stories resist fading. They persist not because they are unresolved legally, but because they are unresolved emotionally. The death at Rough Point occupies that category. It is not a scandal that exploded and burned out. It is a quiet discomfort that lingers. This discomfort is amplified by the simplicity of the event. There was no complex conspiracy, no elaborate scheme. Just a vehicle, a man, a gate, and an outcome that could not be undone. The simplicity strips away distraction. It leaves only the question of response. How institutions respond to harm reveals their priorities. In the case of tobacco, response was delayed for decades. In the case of Tyrella, response was swift and final. In both, the result favored continuity over disruption. This pattern invites reflection on accountability itself. Accountability is not merely about assigning blame. It is about acknowledging impact, examining process, and allowing discomfort to exist long enough to produce understanding. At Rough Point, discomfort was contained. As the estate later transitioned into a public space, visitors encountered curated narratives. Rooms told stories of art, travel, and refinement. The atmosphere emphasized beauty and legacy. The incident at the gates was not foregrounded. This selective storytelling is not unusual. Museums choose emphasis carefully, but it reinforces the divide between celebrated history and uncomfortable truth. The two kinds of death associated with Doris Duke's life remain unevenly remembered. One is folded into public health discourse. The other is relegated to local memory and specialized inquiry. Both deserve attention, not for sensationalism, but for context. Together, they illustrate how power shapes which deaths matter publicly and which fade quietly. Eduardo Tyrella did not die as a symbol. He died as a person. His death acquired symbolic weight only because of where and how it occurred. That symbolism endures because it exposes a fracture in the narrative of benevolent wealth. The story of Doris Duke cannot be told honestly without acknowledging both the lives improved by her fortune and the life lost at her gate. To focus on one without the other is to accept a curated version of history. In the end, the question is not whether Doris Duke was good or bad. Such judgments flatten complexity. The question is how society allows power to operate, and what it chooses to remember when harm occurs within protected spaces. Two kinds of death followed her legacy. One dispersed and normalized. One concentrated and quietly contained. Both matter, and neither should be forgotten. Rough Point still stands, solid and unyielding, its stone walls unchanged by time or controversy. The Atlantic continues to break against the rocks below, indifferent to the stories carried inland by wind and memory. Visitors arrive now through gates that once symbolized separation, stepping onto grounds that were long closed to all but a chosen few. They come for beauty, history, and preservation. Most leave without ever sensing the weight beneath their feet. This is how legacies often settle. They harden into architecture and philanthropy, into plaques and guided tours, into narratives that feel complete because they are carefully finished. Rough Point has become a place of curated remembrance, its rooms arranged to reflect taste, refinement, and cultural reach. The atmosphere invites admiration, not interrogation. Yet the gate remains. It stands where private authority once met public consequence. It marks the point where a life ended and where inquiry stopped. No amount of restoration can remove that fact. It lingers not as a stain on the stone, but as a question suspended in time. Doris Duke lived the rest of her life within that unresolved space. She did not face criminal prosecution. She did not offer public confession. She did not retreat entirely from the world, nor did she re-enter it fully. Her existence continued in the familiar pattern of controlled environments, selective generosity, and guarded privacy. As years passed, her philanthropic legacy expanded. Trusts were established. Cultural institutions benefited. Properties were preserved rather than dismantled. These acts were not symbolic gestures. They were tangible contributions with lasting impact. To deny that would be dishonest. But legacy is not additive alone. It is cumulative. Every life leaves behind both construction and absence. Doris Duke's legacy includes buildings saved, art collected, and institutions sustained. It also includes a man who did not leave Rough Point alive, and a process that did not invite prolonged examination. History struggles with such contradictions because they resist simplification. The temptation is to choose a narrative: benefactor or villain, victim of circumstance or beneficiary of privilege. But real power does not operate within such clean lines. Doris Duke was not defined by a single act. She was shaped by a lifetime of insulation from consequence. That insulation did not make her monstrous. It made her ordinary in a way that is far more unsettling. Wealth at her level alters reality gradually. It trains institutions to respond gently. It encourages deference without instruction. It creates environments where resolution arrives quietly, without friction. Over time, this becomes invisible to those within it and mystifying to those outside. The incident at Rough Point exposed that invisibility briefly. Then it closed again. What remains now is not evidence of guilt or innocence, but a case study in how power functions when it is inherited, normalized, and rarely challenged. The absence of a definitive moral conclusion is not a failure of storytelling. It is the point. The gate that never opened fully represents that absence. It is tempting to demand certainty, to want history to declare verdicts where courts did not. But doing so risks replacing one simplification with another. The more responsible task is to examine conditions rather than conclusions. The conditions were clear. A child inherited unimaginable wealth before developing an independent moral framework. She grew into adulthood, surrounded by professionals tasked with protecting assets rather than questioning authority. She learned that problems could be resolved quietly, efficiently, and without public discomfort. Over decades, this approach became habitual. Rough Point was the physical embodiment of that habit. Controlled access, curated experience, defined boundaries. When tragedy occurred at its threshold, the response followed the same logic. Close the gate, stabilize the narrative, move forward. This was not a conspiracy. It did not require malicious coordination. It required only that systems behave as they always had in the presence of power. That is why the story endures. It endures because it is not exceptional. It is illustrative. Across history, wealth has softened. Accountability not through force, but through familiarity. Institutions grow accustomed to certain names, certain benefactors, certain expectations. Questioning them feels disruptive. Accepting their explanations feels practical. The cost of that practicality is trust. For those who remember Eduardo Tirella, the trust fractured, not because guilt was proven, but because process felt insufficient. Closure arrived without transparency. Finality arrived without visible struggle. The difference matters. Justice is not only outcome, it is method. When method disappears behind authority, even correct conclusions leave residue. Doris Duke's life ended without public reckoning. Her death prompted retrospectives that emphasized her generosity, her eccentricity, her preservation efforts. The incident at Rough Point was mentioned cautiously, often briefly, framed as tragic and resolved. This framing did not erase the story. It froze it. Frozen stories do not heal. They wait. As time continues to pass, Rough Point becomes increasingly detached from the woman who once ruled it. Visitors walk through rooms guided by docents rather than directives. The estate belongs now to public memory rather than private will. This transition offers an opportunity. Public history does not require condemnation, to be honest. It requires inclusion. It requires acknowledging complexity without collapsing it into moral theater. Rough Point can be both a triumph of preservation and a site of unresolved tragedy. These truths do not cancel each other. They coexist. The gate, if treated honestly, becomes a teaching point rather than a boundary. It invites reflection on how societies respond when power intersects with harm. It asks whether systems are designed to uncover truth or to protect continuity. That question extends beyond Doris Duke. It reaches into every institution shaped by concentrated wealth, every benefactor whose name adorns a building, every story that ends too neatly. Eduardo, Tirella's death matters not because it proves something about Doris Duke, but because it reveals something about us, about what we accept, about what we question, about how quickly we move on when resolution feels convenient. The slow deaths caused by tobacco wealth and the sudden death at Rough Point share a final connection. Both were absorbed by systems that prioritized stability over discomfort. Both were normalized in different ways. Both were carried forward without forcing a reckoning proportionate to their impact. This is not an accusation. It is an observation. History often asks for villains and heroes. This story offers neither. It offers a structure that rewarded silence, speed, and insulation. It offers a life lived within that structure. It offers a death that briefly disrupted it. And it offers a gate that still stands, quietly reminding anyone willing to look that some stories were closed too quickly. The richest girl in the world did not escape history. She became part of it, not only through her wealth and generosity, but through the questions that linger at the edge of her legacy. Rough Point is open now. The gates welcome visitors. But there is one threshold that remains uncrossed. It is the space where certainty should have been tested and was not. That space belongs to memory. And memory, unlike verdicts, does not expire. If this story unsettled you, it should have. Because Rough Point is not just a mansion, it is a mirror. It reflects how wealth seals gates, how silence replaces scrutiny, and how some questions are buried without answers. Somewhere between smoke-filled fortunes and a body at a gate, a truth was left unfinished. And it is not the last one of its kind. If you want to keep pulling at the threads powerful histories leave behind, hit that like button and subscribe. The next story does not ask who pulled the trigger. It asks who taught the world to look away.